Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Ever get the feeling that international relations are like, this high-stakes chess game?
Yeah.
But, like, nobody actually told the players that they're supposed to be on the same side.
Yeah, it's a bit like that, isn't it?
It really is. And that's kind of what Détente felt like. It was this whole period back in the 60s and 70s when the US and the Soviet Union were trying, at least a little, to sort of thaw out the Cold War, you know.
Right.
And we've got this, well, a ton of your research on this whole topic, and you seem particularly focused on why this period of supposed cooperation, why it fell apart in the end.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period. There's so much to unpack there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's dive into that. Why did Détente fail?
All right.
Digging into the historical context a bit, and then maybe we could tease out some parallels to, the global landscape as we see it today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head with that chess analogy earlier. I mean, you really have to understand both of these superpowers, they were deeply suspicious of each other.
Oh, for sure.
Every single move was so calculated.
Right.
Each one trying to gain some kind of advantage. It was a delicate balancing act, and as we know, in the end, it just wasn't sustainable.
No, it wasn't. One of, I guess, the cornerstones of Détente had to be the Helsinki Accords.
That's right.
Signed back in 75.
Right.
And, I mean, at the time, this seemed like a huge step towards, well, towards peace, towards actual cooperation.
Yeah.
You had the Soviets making these promises about human rights.
On paper, it looked good.
Yeah.
It did.
But was it all just for show? I mean, if this was meant to be some kind of trust-building exercise, what message did the Soviet response to the Prague Spring, just a few years before, back in '68? What message did that send?
That's the thing about the Helsinki Accords, right? It's fascinating because on paper, they did represent some genuine progress. But, I think this is key, actions speak louder than words.
Always.
Always, yeah. And the Soviet Union's response to the Prague Spring in 1968, well, it spoke volumes, didn't it?
It really did.
And they sent in tanks
Yeah.
to crush a reform movement. It was a blatant violation of everything Helsinki was supposed to stand for. It showed the world, I think, the limitations of détente. And it really exposed that inherent tension, the one between the Soviet desire for stability and the West's push for human rights.
Yeah, because it seems so contradictory. On the one hand, you're signing these agreements promoting human rights, but on the other, you're simultaneously clamping down on those very rights within your sphere of influence.
It's a classic case of, I guess, double standards on the world stage, right?
Exactly.
And to understand that, you have to understand how the Soviets operated. They had this doctrine, the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Right, right.
Basically, what it boiled down to was they believed they had the right to intervene, militarily if necessary, in any socialist country where they felt their interests were threatened.
Oh.
Can you imagine
Yeah.
trying to build trust with someone who basically says, yeah, we can interfere in your affairs whenever we want?
That's a tough pill to swallow,
It is.
to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Europe where we saw these contradictions playing out, was it? Things were really heating up in Africa, too.
That's right.
Can you tell me a bit about what was happening in the Horn of Africa, specifically in the late 70s, and how that impacted this already strained relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
Sure. So in the late 1970s, you had the Soviet-Cuban intervention in Angola,
Right.
and then their backing of Ethiopia against Somalia. These actions, they sent shockwaves through Washington. I mean, this was a clear signal. It was the Cold War playing out on a whole new continent with both these superpowers vying for influence.
It sounds like a classic case of proxy wars.
It was.
Both sides basically choosing sides and then just fueling these conflicts. And I imagine that détente or not, the U.S. probably felt like it couldn't just sit back and watch the Soviets gain a foothold in, well, such a strategically important region.
Exactly. You've got historians like Jeremy Isaacs and Taylor Downing, and they argue that these events just confirmed the suspicions of a lot of people in the West, those who already believed that the Soviets were using détente as a cover.
The cover for what?
For their own expansionist ambitions.
Wow.
And you can't forget Zbigniew Brzezinski,
Right, of course.
President Carter's national security advisor. He saw these actions as a direct challenge to U.S. interests. And, at its core, détente was supposed to be about managing competition, about preventing these kinds of proxy conflicts. So you can see how this really eroded whatever trust was left between these two superpowers.
Yeah, it really undermines the whole point of trying to work together, doesn't it?
It really does.
So we're talking about this backdrop of, well, simmering tensions, broken promises, proxy conflicts. Détente is already on shaky ground, right?
It really is, yeah.
Was there like a single event that just shattered this facade of cooperation? Was it like a tipping point?
Yeah. A lot of historians, they point to the 1973 Ramadan War as a turning point. It really exposed the kind of inherent power imbalances within détente and just how far those limits of cooperation, how far they really went when vital interests were at stake.
Now, for those of us who might need a bit of a refresher, what was the Ramadan War again?
Oh, right.
And I guess, how did it impact this delicate balance that we're talking about, this balance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
Sure. So the Ramadan War, it was this really complex conflict, right, between Israel and then this coalition of Arab states. But I think the key takeaway for our purposes is that it showed the world just how far the U.S. was willing to go to protect its own interests, particularly in that region, even if it meant, sidelining the Soviets.
Wow.
And this, well, it created a lot of resentment on the Soviet side. Historian Odd Westad, he argues that this really bred mistrust.
Yeah.
Because they felt like, the U.S., it was playing both sides.
Right.
Talking about being a partner in détente, but then, simultaneously prioritizing its own agenda.
So détente wasn't this two-way street, this genuine partnership that it was perhaps meant to be.
No, not exactly.
It sounds like the Soviets felt like they were getting a bit of a raw deal.
I think that's a fair way to put it, yeah. Détente, in practice, it often favored the West, and the U.S. held a distinct advantage, particularly when it came to oil,
Right.
which, as we all know, is a pretty vital resource to the global economy. And the Ramadan War, I think it really just brought that power dynamic, that imbalance to the forefront.
Right, pushing the U.S. and the Soviets even further apart.
Exactly.
And this brings up an interesting point, because so far we've mainly talked about political maneuvering, military interventions, but what role did economics play in all of this, in détente's unraveling?
Oh, economics played a huge role. Huge.
Oh, really?
Yeah, remember that 1973 oil crisis, the one we just touched on?
Yeah.
The aftermath of that, it had this really profound impact on the trajectory of détente. Because while the Western economies, they stabilized and in some cases even began to thrive, the Soviet economy, it really went into a tailspin. And it wasn't just about oil either. It really exposed some deeper, more structural issues within the Soviet system itself.
So you essentially have one superpower on the rise, booming economy, and the other one struggling just to keep up. I imagine that created a bit of a strain on their ability to actually cooperate as equals.
Yeah. For sure. Imagine it like a friendship, right?
Okay.
Where one person's constantly asking for loans, It creates an imbalance, right?
You're sure.
It breeds resentment. The U.S., they had less incentive to make these concessions to a struggling superpower. The economic realities of the late 1970s, they exposed the limits of détente and just fueled the tensions that were already there.
It's a perfect example of how these, what seem like domestic issues, like a struggling economy, can have these huge ripple effects.
Absolutely.
On the global stage.
Absolutely. And speaking of ripple effects, there's one more event we need to discuss.
Okay.
One that a lot of historians see as the final nail in détente's coffin.
Okay, let's hear it.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979.
Yeah, that was huge. That was a decisive moment, a real turning point in the Cold War for sure. What drove the Soviets to invade Afghanistan? Why take such a risk?
Yeah.
Especially at that time. And how did that single action, how did it manage to just completely shatter what remained of détente?
So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it really did send shockwaves throughout the world. It was a calculated risk, I'll give them that,
Right.
Under the Soviet leadership, driven by this desire to, I guess, prop up this faltering communist regime and, of course, secure their own southern border. But it proved to be, well, a colossal miscalculation, to say the least.
It just seems like this drastic escalation, especially given, we've talked about this relatively stable relationship that they've been trying to cultivate with the U.S.
Yeah.
How did President Carter, he was a key architect of détente, wasn't he?
Right.
How did he respond to this act of aggression, I guess you could call it?
Yeah, Carter, he was furious. He saw this as a direct challenge to everything détente stood for.
Right.
And in his 1980 State of the Union address, he actually called the invasion the most significant threat to peace since World War II.
Wow.
Which, if you think about his earlier hopes, about this more cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, it's a pretty stark contrast.
That's an understatement. That's a huge statement to make.
Yeah.
What did he do about it? What concrete actions did the Carter administration take to counter what they clearly saw as this dangerous escalation by the Soviets?
Well,
Yeah.
On that. Well, Carter, he responded with a whole series of measures, all designed to really pressure the Soviets. He pulled the U.S. out of the SALT II arms control talks. Those were a big deal at the time.
Right.
He imposed grain embargoes.
Wow.
And he even led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
A lot of people weren't happy about that, but it definitely sent a message.
Oh, it did. These actions, I mean, they effectively signaled the end of détente.
Yeah.
It was over.
It really does seem like that invasion of Afghanistan was, well, straw that broke the camel's back, as they say. Détente was already on life support, but this just pushed it over the edge. So with the U.S. taking this hard line and the Soviets, well, they're bogged down in this costly war, what were the lasting consequences of this breakdown in relations? How did this shape the world, would you say?
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it really had these far-reaching consequences. I mean, it just fueled Cold War tensions even more.
Right.
It deepened the mistrust between these superpowers.
Of course.
And some would argue that it even contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself.
It's interesting to think about, isn't it?
It is.
How one event can have such a huge impact.
It really is. But for me, I think the most tragic legacy of all this is the ongoing instability in Afghanistan. You have the Soviet war, followed by, well, years of civil war, then the rise of the Taliban. It's just created this breeding ground for, well, extremism, for humanitarian crises. And that's something that continues to plague the region even today.
It's a stark reminder that even conflicts that seem, isolated, they can have these ripple effects.
They do.
Ones that reverberate across decades and continents.
Absolutely.
Makes you wonder, knowing what we know now, could things have turned out differently? Is there anything that either side could have done to salvage this?
I think that's the question that historians, they continue to debate, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, some argue that détente was doomed from the start.
Really?
That the ideological divide between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it was too wide to bridge. But then others, they believe that with maybe clearer communication, more realistic expectations, and a greater willingness to compromise, well, maybe, just maybe, détente could have been salvaged.
It's a fascinating debate, for sure. But regardless of what side you take, it seems like there are some valuable lessons we can learn from all of this, from both the successes and the failures of détente. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here today, what's one big idea that you hope our listeners take away from all of this, from our exploration of this, well, this tumultuous period?
For me, I think the biggest takeaway is just how complex history is. It doesn't offer us these easy answers or these predictable roadmaps.
No, it definitely doesn't.
But it does offer these valuable lessons, and they can really help us to navigate the complexities of international relations today,
I see what you mean.
By studying the past, we gain a deeper understanding of the here and now.
Yeah. It's about learning from the mistakes of those who came before us, recognizing, that enduring power of human connection.
For sure.
And I guess just holding on to hope. Holding on to that hope for a more peaceful and cooperative future.
Well said. That's a great way to put it. History reminds us that even when we're faced with these seemingly impossible challenges, progress, well, it is possible.
It is.
But it takes constant effort, open communication, and a shared commitment to building that better future.
And on that note, we hope this deep dive into the unraveling of détente has given you some things to think about. That it's given you a deeper understanding of this really pivotal period in history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and of course, keep learning from the past, because as we've seen today, it definitely has a lot to teach us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.